Hello, you've reached Lisa. Lisa talking again, and we are back for our very, very belated look at the Guardian newspaper now. We're in a series, we're looking at what broke Britain. We had a series where we looked at what's keeping the UK stable. We looked at all the different factors that made us a very strong, very, very stable country. But no matter where we went, we came back to the same core of instability, which is a tiny, obsolete media and policy making culture who are currently demonstrating their dysfunction on Twitter. Now, I've put underneath an article by a guy called Torsten Bell, who is the head of the Resolution Foundation, who are a think tank. A think tank is like an organisation who just kind of do policy making. The economists go and work there. I'd hoped, that's why I went to the LSE, in the hope that I could go and work in policy making. No, they don't do poor people at all. And they don't do people who know how these systems work. But what he's discussing in this article is the generation of online echo chambers. And he's discussing the view from this little bubble where our mediating class are actually generating instability and not aware that they're doing it. Now, for a lot of people looking into this country, they don't understand how things have kind of got so bad. Like, the core of modern economics is that the context changes around economics. And when you're looking at the end of like an event like the financial crisis should lead us to ask questions about what has changed since the last crisis of this size. We actually know this in lots of systems in the UK. And largely how stable a country will be through this process depends on your mediating class. And this article by Torsten Bell is written from the centre of this echo chamber of this mediating class who not only can't see the context that's changed around them, but are actually actively hostile to it. And at the centre of it is the Guardian newspaper. But what's crucial to understand about this culture is they don't know they're the problem. The rest of the world do. Men like Vladimir Putin are actively using the predictability that these cultures are creating, the fake social movements that they're generating, the dysfunction online, are actually using it. My thesis in 2015 identified a policy reflex that's generating instability that's still being demonstrated over and over again, because I identified that our mediating class at the core of this hadn't adapted and couldn't. And we're just locked into this kind of echo chamber that he's describing, with the only function being to kind of spread misinformation and generate the risk of extremism. Now, when I discuss kind of the system development in the UK, what I was discussing is the fact that actually in the period since the last crisis of this type in the late 70s, all the systems I'm concerned with had developed. Social care, looked after children duties, our cash transfer system had matured. These are systems which cross the paid, unpaid, market and family sphere and link to government responsibility. They're shaped by a number of tensions. And they actually are very healthy, and they're stabilizers, and they're central to our 21st century economic needs. But this culture, who are centered in this echo chamber online, are actively hostile to them, because the economics that we've had for the last 30 years has said that if you just strip back at these systems as a response to everything, everything will be fine. And this is what's been generating instability. Now, the Guardian newspaper are very, very interesting, and for a long time people will be looking. I don't think they understand how historically significant they are. People will be fascinated by the output of the Guardian in the last 10 years and the tweets around them. For centuries, we'll be studying them. Economic historians will be studying the output of this little echo chamber. It's so important, because what they have demonstrated is how a mediating class who cannot adjust to change generate instability at the end of an economic cycle. Now, the Labour Party are completely unelectable. In the UK, we reject fascism consistently, and because they kind of abused and intimidated their own MPs, because they abused and intimidated journalism, because they manufactured fake social movements where they used abuse, intimidation and violent kind of intimidation of vulnerable people, the fake social movement that they generate to stop people accessing democracy during the period where austerity focused on our cash transfer system and local authorities will be remembered for a long time. But because they turned on Jewish people, they do not understand. They are completely unelectable. And the problem is that this leaves the Guardian exposed. Now, the Guardian they've primed a reputation for themselves as journalists. I remember there was an advert in the 80s about looking at situations from a different perspective. And we didn't realise until the last 10 years that they're not journalists at all, but they don't know that they're not journalists. You read the FT, you're getting 30 minutes, an overview of the domestic and international news, and it will be impartial, it will be informed, and it will be reliable information. The Guardian distort everything through the lens of the Labour Party's need. Their function is to prevent discussion of political consensus, which all the systems I'm concerned with are always subject to complete consensus. It's the rule of law at the centre position with our economics, to distort discussion of it to a left-right spectrum for the Labour Party. They claim significant power and occupy the place that they have in the Westminster lobby on the basis that they have a democratic mandate through the Labour Party. The Labour Party can't be elected again. Their other authority comes from them speaking for these public sector systems, for, you know, welfare systems, for our social care systems. And what they've revealed in the last 10 years is not only did they not know how these systems worked for the last 30 years, but they believe that these systems could be used to remove about 30% of the country from democracy and return us to a 19th century norm. Now, another pillar of the Guardian's kind of identity is this kind of, you know, the word TERF came from this culture. We found out in the last 10 years that they believed that feminism was about political media cultures from one of the most powerful countries in the world, seeking out vulnerable people in social movements to subordinate them. And that's what they thought feminism was. Political media cultures placing themselves in competition with vulnerable women to subordinate them. And then when trans rights activism kind of took that, kind of was a completely kind of, well, that's what feminism is. You know, the Guardian have held up trans rights activism. Trans is a very new category in equality legislation. Held them up as the face of their own dysfunction, thrown them to the far right and jeopardised trans rights for good with a backlash. And what we found out over the last 10 years is all these different aspects of the Guardian's identity had existed behind this elite kind of social wall that kind of seals off this echo chamber, and it's from within this echo chamber that Torsten Bell's writing. He's at the core of one of the most important think tanks in the country, and they don't know that they are not only in the middle of an echo chamber, but the source of it. Now, one of the functions of your mediating class is that they have to be able to mediate change. In every kind of revolution and major change in history, the severity of that change will depend on the mediating class. The French Revolution, the nobles refused to pay tax. I think in the collapse of the Chinese imperial system, there were huge tensions, and we'll talk about the British East India Company another day, but there were huge tensions within the mediating class. The Russian Revolution, you have to look at the mediating class and what emerged there. This is incredibly important. But while this culture have been locked in this tiny little bubble on Twitter, they basically, like, we have now got to the point where we've balkanized ourselves, catapulted out of the European Union. 100,000 people are dead because of austerity. We've been left with systems like universal credit, which has cost 20 billion. We have crisis in all these systems like social care and all these systems that are central to our 21st century needs. But because of this bubble, because it's actually a class bubble, they're actually preventing us as a country from transitioning this crisis at all. One of the reasons that I had a PTSD wobble about this video was because I had to sit and ask myself, is it safe to talk about The Guardian online? We are not a country where it's dangerous for women to speak. The Guardian and Labour Party are cultures where it's dangerous for anybody to go near who might injure their identity. Now, in the UK, we have incredibly mature systems. So, for instance, like social workers in the UK, and lots of other professionals too, are taught to reflect on the power that they have. They are taught to, you don't go into social work thinking you're doing something good. Every decision you make, you know that it's harmful. When you are exercising the power of the state, you have to understand the power that you have and the difference in power between you and the person you're talking to. You have to reflect on your own identity, and if you start identifying yourself as good, you will lash out with narcissistic rage if somebody questions those identities with all the power you have. So we don't do that in the UK. But what the Guardians sell is an identity of themselves as good, bettering the poor in a way that is just staggering, like that we have moved past in this country 50 years ago. And so what's resulted is like an echo chamber online, which is protected by narcissistic rage. But because they see themselves as representing the poor, the marginalized, they're lashing out at those people. Now, in my lifetime, in my adult lifetime, I have seen the Guardian at the centre of a war on Islam, turning on Jewish people, and a policy reflex that's killed kind of 100,000 people. But they still think that they're the front line of the fight against fascism. The week after next, I'm going to discuss the symbiosis between the centre-left and the far-right, and the way that they have, you know, between Blue Labour and the EDL, and even trans rights activism, the way that the centre-left, far-right political spectrum works. At the centre of the political spectrum that the Guardian sell is a Fabian identity, which represents a culture we were supposed to move past in World War II. All our modern systems are a reaction against this pre-war doing good for the poor and actually harming people. The kind of outer edges of the political spectrum are the far right or the far left or this Fabian identity. But the reality is that all these three identities are fundamentally rejected. But the problem is, because this is a class, when you're looking at political economy, you're talking about a group at the top of our political economy. You can't make these people budge because they are from universities like Oxford, Cambridge, the LSE, and this is a social network. And so at present, they have no legitimacy with regards to journalism, no democratic mandate, have no knowledge of the systems that they're claiming. They're forming a protective barrier so that someone like me, I have an extensive understanding of these systems. I'm not safe to go near these people. I had to really question whether it was safe for me to talk at all. I wrote for The Guardian in 2010 because they thought that the best way to deal with austerity was, well, they prevented anybody accessing democracy. They would recruit people to write poverty porn. I refused. They wanted me to be the face to tell women that they were the voice for women, while they were deliberately not only editing my work to edit discussion of political consensus out so these systems and policies wouldn't be discussed. But, you know, they were recruiting vulnerable people and refusing to pay them unless they were abused under the line by comments, because it was essential to their austerity strategy to have vulnerable people abused by their readers. You know, in the last election, we saw, you know, abuse and intimidation rolled out because The Guardian and Labour had basically conditioned their followers. You know, there's never been a difference between welfare policy for Tory and the Labour Party. It's just a fact. It's the nature of the beast. You know, they had their supporters abuse and intimidating anybody, because if anybody discussed welfare policy or discussed the reality of these systems, Labour and the Guardian readers were like, well, you're only doing that to injure our identity. No, actually, we're doing it because we've just seen a policy reflex that's killed 100,000 people and we need to know how these systems work. But when you read the article by Torsten Bell, you're reading someone writing from the middle of an echo chamber who doesn't know that he's writing for the newspaper at the centre of it. Now, when you look at it's very difficult with neoliberal papers because everything's about individualism and it's about people. They've made this about themselves. You look at someone like Polly Toynbee. This is a very rich old woman who's from a family name from a pre-war liberal class, who fundamentally believed that austerity would remove about 30% of people from democracy, placed herself front and centre of social movements to prevent people accessing democracy, and then felt that gave her the right for 10 years to accuse the Tories of being heartless, as she used her column week in, week out to basically lie and say that this was, you know, just the mean old Tories, when she was a direct component. When Polly Toynbee writes for Capita and then writes her column in The Guardian about, you know, the danger of privatization, she sees no dissonance when she writes books about low pay. And then, you know, she believes that she has the right to feed on poor people because in her world, she is of a class where, you know, that's her function. She doesn't understand that enfranchisement happened, that the rule of law happened, and that actually that's pretty offensive. You know, you have men like Patrick Butler. One of the impacts, Patrick Butler is the social policy editor, I think, at The Guardian. I don't really pay attention. One of the impacts of austerity, because they chose to focus on our cash transfer system and our local authorities, it simultaneously attacked domestic abuse services, looked after systems, children's services, made them more punitive. The means that women had to leave abuse were gone. But there's a legal requirement in this country that you have to leave if there's abuse or you are culpable. And then a policy came in that said that adoption had to be decided within 6 months. And we saw this unprecedented thing where women were having their children removed because they hadn't left abuse because their ability to have been removed. And then their children were being adopted out almost straight away. I worked on an adoption which was just... I've worked in some grim situations, but sitting in a barrister's office while a woman's told she's never going to see her children again, and it's, you know, even though she's never done anything, was one of the most, my legs buckled. I couldn't breathe. And this wasn't, you know, Patrick Butler responded to a High Court judge intervening with James Mumby, the head of family division, issued a judgment which was called the ReBS judgment, which stemmed the tide of adoptions and said this is what the criteria you're supposed to be making these decisions on. Patrick Butler's response at The Guardian to a judgment which clearly showed that women were being very harmed, that children were being very much harmed by this, was he complained that the middle class baby supply was being interrupted, because he by this point assumed austerity which killed 100,000 people, which left children in our looked after system unprotected, and which did this, was a good way to generate babies as a consumer item for middle class people. You know, you've got people like Helen Pidd. In a period that, like, austerity impacted the North quite significantly more than the South, I think. The Northern correspondent, Helen Pidd, is just... She took a Syrian refugee in so that she could show him off like a doll in The Guardian. Said, like, in a period where the job centre were behaving utterly abusively, this traumatised refugee was slagged off in her column in The Guardian because he hadn't done what the job centre said. And then during the floods, well, like around where I live in the Calder Valley, it floods routinely. We're very good at dealing with flood. But that particular year, the floods were all over the north. She took her Syrian refugee down to Hebden Bridge so he could get his picture taken by all her middle-class friends. Look, it's a refugee. While the whole of the north, towns who'd never been flooded before, desperately needed resources, doesn't know it's racist, doesn't know that you don't actually exploit somebody who's leaving a war-torn country and do that to them, complained that he spoke about the war. Like, I'll put the article underneath, it's staggering. Her present thing is she goes to northern towns and she complains about all the brown people who can't speak English, and she doesn't know that she's just a bog-standard racist. A trans athlete called Lauren Jessica committed a very serious double murder and used to run at an athletics club in the town where I live. Helen Pidd said the double warning was a warning for transphobia. This athletics club that this person used to run at has children running with it. And she doesn't know that, like, a double murder is not a warning for transphobia when somebody, you know what I mean? These people have no understanding of 21st century norms, or, you know, because they exist above democracy, above the law, and they can only see their own identity. They don't know how offensive they are, and they're demonstrating this openly. Now, the problem is that The Guardian are not in isolation. What I found at the LSE is that this Fabian identity is also at the centre of this economics institution. And what I'm going to talk about next week is academia. One of the things that came out in the last kind of few years is that the links between this culture and academia, the way that they have shaped academia, has caused quite serious weaknesses. So I'm going to look at that next week, and then the week after I'm going to look at how they generate the risk of the far right, who thankfully in this country are routinely rejected. Now on Sunday I'm going to be back with my look at Persia. I'm actually getting really excited. I've been looking at the book of Daniel. It's one of the most important historical texts in the Bible. I'm actually staggered by this. So I'm going to come back on Sunday. I'm going to talk about ancient dynasty, the roots of dynastic Persia and the book of Daniel. And I'll be back next Wednesday with that video looking at kind of academia in the series about what broke Britain. I'm sorry about the delay. I just had a PTSD wobble. It is genuinely dangerous to discuss The Guardian because they identify themselves as good. They view anybody discussing their role in our political economy in a very disturbing way, and their kind of readers and supporters are quite, well, they're batshit, I'll be honest with you. Now, you can still talk to me on Patreon. I've set the bar at like £2.50 or something, which means that you can talk to me, but it's just like a gate to keep the trolls out. I'm still crowdfunding for kind of materials and resources to improve the quality of these videos. I'm very sorry about the delay, and I will see you on Sunday.